Welcome to the 101st episode of Concussion Talk Podcast. I'm Nick Mercer. And before I start today, I'll do the thing with sponsor HeadCheck Health.
Concussion Talk Podcast is presented by HeadCheck Health. HeadCheck Health bridges the gaps in concussion care through simple, powerful technology. Join organizations like the Canadian Football League, Track Factory Racing, the Canadian Junior Hockey League, Eastern Washington University, and Volleyball Canada, who rely on HeadCheck Health to improve communication and optimize care. Visit headcheckhealth.com for more.
And so thank you to HeadCheck Health. And please not sponsor, but you could sponsor, that'd be great. But subscribe, rate, review my podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Verbal goes on. Anyway, and please consider supporting my podcast and my website on Patreon. So go to patreon.com/concussion talk. And with all that said and done, I'd like to introduce my guest, which I'll actually get her to introduce herself, Julie Stamm, or should I say Dr. Julie Stamm. And she has literally written the book about concussion in youth sports. And so we'll talk about that. And the title of the book is the Brain on Youth Sports. And frankly, the cover says it all. The brain says it's called The Brain on Youth Sports, the science, the myths, and the future, which is frankly what it's all about. So that encapsulates this podcast and this interview. And one more thing that I'd like to say before I get Julie to introduce herself and just talk about her credentials. But first of all, one note from her website, which is juliestam.com/book. It says, her little summary of the book says, no athlete has to sustain hundreds of impacts and repetitive brain trauma in order to gain the benefits of sports. And I think that's the whole lesson for this podcast. So first of all, Julie, welcome, and our Dr. Julie Stamm, welcome, and please introduce yourself and your tons of credentials.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk with you. So I got started in this world as an athletic trainer. So I'm a licensed athletic trainer in sports medicine, and I had a patient that just didn't get better after a concussion. Mm-hmm. And, he was young, freshman in high school. And it was just so moving to see how that affected his life beyond just sports, friendships, school, all of that. And that's really what got me interested in this. And then I was a grad assistant athletic trainer at Boston University for a year, and then joined the CTE Center, the Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center out at Boston University, where we studied long-term consequences of repetitive impacts. And so I've done research on CTE, on concussions themselves, concussion education and management. I've done research on my main area of focus being the long-term consequences of hitting your head a lot as a kid. So we studied, what happened in those who are older based on when they started hitting their head repeatedly and potentially, disrupting that development, which I'm sure we'll talk more about on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And you're now at University of Wisconsin in Madison, right?
So I'm at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I also teach anatomy. So I love anatomy, neuroanatomy, learning about the body and the brain, and then I also do research here as well.
So what was your PhD thesis?
My PhD it was in anatomy and neurobiology, and it was about my thesis was on the age of first exposure to repetitive brain trauma in youth football.
So you kind of go on both ends, youth and CTE, which is more associated with older, not necessarily players, older athletes, older individuals. But we've seen some I remember some indications that in even high school kids or university kids, not sure. I know there was talk of that a few years ago in New York State, I believe. There's a college athlete who died, and he was in his freshman year, I believe,
Yeah,
and
there was
CTE
there was somebody
or
recently, I think,
suicide.
who
Yeah.
there have been several cases. I know there was a recent player, I believe in New York, who just passed away after a hit on the field in high school.
Oh,
There have been several cases, unfortunately, of suicides, both post-concussion
yeah.
and potentially due to CTE, although it is really difficult to tell, especially when they're younger, if it's
Yeah.
actually the CTE, if there's enough
Or
damage yet.
subconcussive, because I know that
Yeah.
in Ontario, province in Canada, I'm in a different province, but the Romans law that passed, which is big,
Mhm.
and that's to prevent athletes from going back concussed, like Bradford, they receive concussion, go back on the field. So that's an important rule, and that I know that was she died on the field. That was the
Mhm.
20. I'm not gonna say a date because I'm just I can't say for sure. But I'm gonna say 2012, but again, I shouldn't because I don't really know 2014. Anyway, but yeah, it's what I thought you first. Mostly I saw you following Instagram, which is great. So thank you. And I saw that I was reading your little excerpts about your book, the brain and youth sports, and the first one to just ask you generally, what are the primary? I'm sure it sounds like you got kind of ended up wanting to write this book because of the myths surrounding the trauma in sports and the value of sports and how that's overlooked a lot of times, and when it's just one side, just it's brain time is bad, and it is bad. But I mean, sports are brain time is bad. Yet that brain time is sports, therefore sports are bad. And so
Yeah.
you kind of was what's sort of word you can dispelled. There you go. Dispelled those myths. So what are some of these important myths about you sports that you find are so important to again dispel because they're not like have enough.
Yeah. Yeah. It really was one of the big reasons I wrote the book. There were a lot of articles being written about potentially delaying the start of tackling in football, and a lot of just bad arguments and myths that were being thrown around for why we shouldn't make any changes. And so, one of the major myths when it comes to repetitive impacts in sports is that, well, kids are just small. They're small. They don't run that fast, so they don't hit that hard or that much. I was at a sixth grade football game, and a dad told me that. Oh, don't worry about it because they're small. They don't hit that hard or that much.
Yeah,
and it's just not true. And maybe they aren't actually hitting quite as hard, but
it's all relative.
Yeah, it's all relative. And a child's head is larger compared to their body than an adult. And that plus you put a football helmet on, especially, or even, hockey helmets too have weight to them. And that creates kind of this bobblehead effect. And as a result, the brain feels the force essentially very similar to the high school and college counterparts. The brain is moving in the skull, and that the speed and the acceleration is very, very similar to high school and college counterparts. And when you really look at the impacts per session, so per game or per practice, the number of impacts that they sustain are actually very similar too. There are fewer generally over the season because a youth season tends to be shorter than high school or college season. But the number of impacts per session are about the same, and they can still incur hundreds of impacts in just a short season.
Right. So those are some of the myths. So how would you, if someone came to you, like, for example, that father you said the grade 6 football game came to you and said, they don't hit that hard because their kids, don't worry about it. What would you? How I know because your book, one thing you do in the book is get it down just go to so people can, without having necessarily a scientific knowledge of this, just understand that this it is all relative and this. But so what would you say to that person? Well, not what would you say?
Yeah, I would say, it doesn't look like it. I think it's an argument that comes from just the experience watching the game. And it doesn't look like those hits are that bad, but really the science just doesn't agree with that as far as what the brain feels, essentially, that with the forces that are experienced by the brain. And, those impacts matter. There's research that shows that there are changes in the brain of youth athletes and high school athletes over the course of a season, even in those who don't have a concussion. So just because they don't end up with symptoms doesn't mean that those repetitive impacts aren't affecting the brain. And they're children. So there's so much happening in the brain of an athlete, of a child that's developing, the laying down of myelin to help make signals travel faster, making so many different connections in the brain, and then fine tuning those connections. And when we're hitting our head repeatedly, we could be disrupting that process. So, even if they don't have symptoms right away, there are potential consequences of that. And there's no harm in just not hitting at that age. Like they can play sports and they should play sports, but if we can play versions that don't have inherent impacts, we're not going to prevent everything. That's just the risk of sports. But those impacts that are just naturally part of the game don't need to happen when they're young.
Right, and that requires a whole lot of the different training and coaching for these athletes. Now, actually, a good friend of mine, one of my better friends, I just saw in August. He's in Ontario. His daughter, or for one daughter, but I don't know if the second one will go into it. He plays a ring, which is like hockey, but it's not hockey because it's a different sport than hockey, but it's very similar to hockey. It's like a stick without a blade, and you have a ring, and you have to use the ring.
Okay.
And that was in remember. Yes, his wife. Is that contact? There's no contact when they get to a certain age because he's not old enough now, no matter what, to play contact sports. But and so it's how you know it's not contact, but like much like soccer, it is contact, but it's not supposed to be like, because technically there's contact because you do touch, but like you're not supposed to collide like doing hockey and football, but you do instantly, and that's probably what causes one of the bigger problems of why there's so many. But I mean, so I know like that's kind of rambling here. I know in the States and in Canada, it's football and hockey kind of flip-flopped at both sides. Like States are more football and Canada's more hockey, but it's both in both countries. But what are other sports that you think are really like, honestly, rugby in like Australia?
Yeah.
I noticed now that I have a lot of followers in Melbourne for some reason, which is great.
Yeah.
But I don't know why. But yeah. So what would you say? What are the other sports that you think there need to be? Yeah, I know every sport needs to keep aware of it, but are there some sports that you think should really keep their head up? Obviously it's not part of the fun, but
yeah.
Okay, my phone is ringing. There we go. Okay. I hope that didn't disturb anybody, but my phone was going there.
Yeah. No, I think it's an important question. And I think, looking at the repetitive impacts is important because concussion risk is higher in certain sports, but they may not have as many repetitive impacts. Football and hockey, as you said, definitely. Rugby is definitely growing and growing, it's growing all over North America. It's growing everywhere. So that's going to be a big one. And soccer isn't collision, but the head is a big part of the game. And it's not just the headers, but going for a header and hitting each other or going for a header and falling. Yeah, that's big. Also lacrosse is one. It's in the men's side anyway, because checking is part of the boys and men's lacrosse. So those are sports of interest. But I think the other ones that haven't been studied enough would be, Australian rules football is getting some attention now, but wrestling, even cheerleading.
How you would even just like eliminate contact in Australia as your rules football. That's all about contact.
Yeah, I did have someone tell me once, though, that was from Australia, that it's changed a lot over the years, and there's more, a little bit less physicality and a little more art to it,
Okay.
But I honestly don't know enough about it to say more. But
I shouldn't really have said anything.
Yeah. But even cheerleading is one that is often overlooked.
Yeah.
But during competitive cheerleading and you're doing stunts and throws and all that, like, I had cheerleaders hit their head on somebody else's knee, or they come down on a shoulder, or they aren't caught correctly in the basket that's another way. Or, you're one of the people catching the flyer and you take a foot to the head or something, it's one that I think gets overlooked and deserves some more study too.
Yeah, I saw it. I had a USA cheer, the Lori and Jim, I believe it's Jim, on the podcast in episode 94. So then they talked about, also had an athlete here who's now also an athletic trainer. She was a gymnast, and she coaches our local university cheerleading squad here. And concussion is a major, very important. They've listed, USA chair, for example, is listed teach aids, which if you know them very well, but to give it, not but to show their concussion programs for their athletes and coaches. So that's important. So So you also did I know you studied Harvard, you did the brain bank in Boston, and so was that all like CTE you looked at there, or did you was it only in experienced athletes, or was it also in youth? Did you do both, or did you just do one side?
Yeah. So I was more on the clinical research side. So while we went out to the brain bank, I didn't study the brains themselves post-mortem. I studied people who were living, and I studied it more with brain imaging.
Right.
And so I studied former athletes primarily. So mostly former NFL players, but in one of our other studies, we had former college, former high school players too. But I looked at the outcomes based on when they started playing in youth. So we asked our former NFL players, they were all 40 to 60 years old. We asked them when they started playing. And then for some of the studies, we divided them using age 12, because that was a good measure for what we were looking at. It's not right for everything in this type of research, because some structures don't follow that trajectory. When we looked at one structure we didn't use a cutoff because it developed even to 14, 15 years old. So it really does depend on what structures and functions you're looking at and how they develop. But we found that those who started playing before age 12 were significantly worse off than those who started playing at 12 or later on things like self-reported depression, both self-reported and objective measures of executive functioning. So things like planning, decision-making, behavioral control, multitasking, those kind of things. And also, they had more apathy. And we saw differences in the brain too. So differences in a structure that connects the right and left sides of the brain, the corpus callosum.
Yeah. And
saw that one of the measures suggests that maybe they didn't lay down that myelin, or that kind of coating, that insulation on their axons and neurons in the brain as much as those who started playing later, because they were hitting during the time when that was supposed to happen. So several studies there that we did, that even though we were working with older individuals, we were kind of looking at the consequences of what they did with you as youth, but later in life.
And you mentioned the myelin sheath, I know that. So you mentioned it a bunch of times. And also, so with that, I know that's a protective layer around the axons. And then the tau protein is more into the brain, right? But that, with the myelin sheath protecting, is that at all, or is that,
yeah, it's the same part. So that it's in the same part. It's the tau is a stabilizing protein, and it's in the axon. It's just not, the myelin surrounding the axon, and the tau is within the axon. That's helping to kind of keep that, it's stabilizing the axon. So they're both kind of on that same area, and both are affected potentially with that stretching and kind of strain that happens with repetitive impacts and concussions.
Right.
We didn't find that the evidence right now really suggests that the more years you play, the greater the risk of CTE. And that kind of goes with, like, if you play younger, you probably play more years. Because most people will play
so a year is like measured by hours played or whatever, like impact kind of thing, or is that measured? Some not necessarily measured by years.
And that's a great question. It's not perfect. It's just used kind of as a proxy for total impacts. I thought that if we just ask more, how many years did you play, or how old were you when you started, and kind of look at age that way. And it's with a thought that the more years you played, the more impacts, but it's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect. But those who had more years, which would probably mean more impacts, were at greater risk.
Yeah.
And you probably played more and sustained more impacts if you start younger. But other than that, just playing young in itself doesn't seem to increase the risk of CTE. But we did find, and the CTE Center did find, that in people who got CTE anyway, who went on to get that disease, their symptoms started about 13 years earlier if they started playing before age 12. And the younger they were when they started, for every year younger they were when they started playing, their symptom onset was about 2.5 years earlier. And so it seems that we may be diminishing our reserve. I compare it to driving a car, and if you have two cars that are the same make and model and going the same speed down the same road, and one has a full tank of gas and one has 3/4 of a tank, they can both go for a really long time, but one's going to run out of gas first. And if we're not filling our neuronal tank, like our brain's tank, then, we're going to run out of gas first. And that may be what's happening if we're hitting our head a lot as a kid. We're not necessarily filling that tank. And if something like CTE or another degenerative disease or even aging starts to interact with that, we may run out of that reserve faster.
So does aging, in the weeds of this, but does aging really affect the growth of the tau protein or the disintegration of the myelin at all? Does age have a disproportionate impact on that, or is it mostly just the impacts and the stuff because of it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the tau itself, we shouldn't really be seeing much of that tau in the brain when we're older. Typically, it shouldn't be there. And we do have some degeneration that happens with aging, but we also, if we exercise our brain and exercise our body throughout life, we can help to increase that reserve too. So, some people can be completely sharp for a very long time. And that helps to exercise the brain. There was another study that showed that symptoms started later in people who had jobs that really required a lot more critical thinking. Right. So that's a positive side. But aging definitely though can lead to some some age-related degeneration in the brain. Not necessarily with the tau though. We shouldn't see a lot of that tau, even if in somebody who's quite a bit older.
Okay, and you were mentioning the tank, which actually I've seen a lot of people that follow on say, social media, with the not necessarily tank, but they have a glass full of water, and they say, use this much, you pour out like some water because there's so much energy in the day. So it's like the same thing, like per day. It's just the length just goes on for your life, really. So, and that's my show me ignorance for it, but. When in big football and even hockey, and I never played hockey, so I don't know. But when would you start hitting or contacting in football? And if you know about the States, hockey in the US, when does that hitting start?
Yeah. So hockey, the US and Canada, to my understanding, both have rules now that the earliest that checking would be introduced would be age 13. And I know some leagues are even older, and there's a push for some to be older. And that's been really effective in reducing concussion rates and impacts, and which is great. And hockey, at least in the United States, has never been healthier as a sport. Like there are more kids playing than there have ever been, which is awesome. Football, on the other hand, in some leagues, you can start tackling at age 5.
Ooh.
So it's so young.
Yeah.
Most leagues aren't quite tackling that young, but there is opportunity to tackle that young. But by 7-8 years old, most kids that are in it are tackling. But those numbers are down. We are seeing fewer and fewer people playing, young children playing tackle football, and more children playing flag, which is awesome.
Yes.
But there's no rule on that.
I know there's a big push, like Sarge 1 year tweets, but Brett Favre was saying that, and I've seen, I think Drew Brees also to the importance of, because even like 7 or 5 is, I think, ridiculous, but it's 7 or 8. Does, I mean, the kids, like, no matter how well they coach, they are 7-8-year-old kids, and they don't necessarily know when to hit or don't appreciate they're kids, right? So they just want to play sports and like have fun with their friends and hit their friend, haha, and then all of a sudden, like that's when when people are expecting you to hit, then it's quite different. They can brace for it and they can take appropriate actions. But when you're not expecting it, it's a different term altogether. So what would you you would hope, I mean, you would be a proponent of no checking hockey, no contact football. Like, how would you? What do you? Because you did play a lot of sport when you were a kid. You probably still do, but I mean, and so I shall kind of back on that question of talk more the benefits of sports, the importance of sports. So why should kids play sports? I guess
kids. So I think every kid should have the opportunity to play sports, and I believe that we can be pro sports and pro brain at the same time.
Yeah.
And sports have so many benefits. There's physical benefits, physical health, physical activity. Kids who are active as kids and adolescents are far more likely to be active as adults. And we have an obesity epidemic around the world. So
team sports
and team sports are particularly great with mental health benefits and social benefits. Having that team to rely on, it can be really important for kids and provide so many emotional, social, mental health benefits, and also the life skills that we learn in sports, teamwork, having, to go through something hard and get back up from that, learning how to win, with grace and lose with humility. And, all of that is so important just for life skills, determination, perseverance, grit. These are all great things that we can learn in sports, and that, we don't want to be getting rid of any sports. I'm definitely not for that, because they're, different people have different loves of different sports, and we want to keep every opportunity we can, but we can do that without hitting our heads repeatedly, especially as kids.
Exactly. Yeah. So actually, my last question, I have a two-parter. First of all, which is kind of big two-parter, which is, what sports did you play? As you said, and I read you're three sport athletes. So what were your sports? And also, what would you see change in sports to allow, especially contact sports, to allow them to continue to be enjoyed by the youth? And
So I played volleyball, basketball, and softball, and I played a little bit of soccer when I was much younger too, but primarily volleyball, basketball, softball, and I still play volleyball and basketball now. And I always get kind of insulted, honestly, when people say like, "Oh, but kids have to hit to be tough." Well, I didn't hit my head repeatedly in any of my sports, and I consider myself pretty tough. I just think it's just not true that you have to hit to learn that. And I think for the future, I would like to see, in a perfect world, no tackling before high school, or at least that age 13 cutoff that's also used in hockey. I just don't think we need to. We can teach so much about the game in football. We can teach so much about athleticism and what the rules are of the game. We can create great athletes overall, and get stronger athletes too before they start hitting each other. So they're more physically ready to take that impact when they start. Right now, a big problem in football tends to be that some kids go through puberty early, some go through late, and you can have some massive size discrepancies there. And that can cause problems.
I don't know if you've seen that video about this Andy, the Philadelphia Eagles coach, the while ago. His name now. Pump ass kick competition with that. And it was like a few years ago. He was coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. And the big guy, Andy
Reid.
Andy Reid. You ever seen that? The kid, he was a kid playing pump ass and kick, and he was like man size, and they're all, and the kid was like 8 years old. Like he was the same age, and so
it's crazy. Yeah, we can be so different, and that can be really dangerous on the field too. And some leagues, account for weight limits and things like that. But why not just let them get a little bit stronger and become great athletes first, and then they can start tackling. And I don't think it will. I actually think it would help save the game too, because you look at hockey. Hockey's been doing great since they delayed the onset of checking, and football could really increase its number of participants if flag or another version became the way that we played when we're young. There's a new version called tackle bar, where there's bars on the back of the players, and they can reach around like they're wrapping up for a tackle, except instead of tackling, they rip the bars off of the back. We can have some kind of graded different ways to play the game that would just ease them into the tackle form too. And, we can start teaching certain skills when they're young, and on tackling dummies, once they're getting close to that age cutoff without tackling each other. I think there are ways to do it where the sport could thrive, but we can also protect that developing brain.
That's very important, because the sport, like you're saying, sports is, you learn so much from playing either individual sports or team sports. But I love team sports and with that, and but besides and the points you hopefully help the points you made today in your book are very similar. So, but before we go, please just hawk your book, really, the branding on youth sports. So why should people, what you have to listen to the podcast, you know why it's important to read it, but what are some of the important points you may think of making the book?
Yeah, so it starts out with an intro that does include all of the science behind the benefits of sports, and also the culture of sports, which is the big thing we need to change. And then I talk about the science in general. So talking about both, concussions and subconcussive impacts, what is actually happening in brain development. So why should we care? I talk about CTE as well. And then I think a really important part is that the myths and misconceptions that a lot of and bad arguments that a lot of people have said and maybe heard.
You touched on a few. Are there any others that you think are apparent, like very common myths and backgrounds?
Yeah, I hear a lot of like, well, we shouldn't be talking about football because soccer is bad too, or things like that, and that two things can be bad at the same time, and also that you have to hit young to become a superstar, because if you don't hit young, how are you going to learn, and how are you going to end up playing in college? And that's also just not true. And I address a lot of those myths like that, hopefully with some ways that parents and coaches and others involved can counter these arguments. You have that in your back pocket now to counter that if it's something that you hear. And also then I give some tips for how we can improve that safety, both with just youth sports in general and in your own community, what you can do as well to help improve youth sports.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And it's a great book and a great idea and a great theme. And also, I didn't ask this earlier, but you're assistant clinical professor at Wisconsin. So what do you teach? What will you be teaching? Not necessarily tomorrow, but this term, I say.
Yeah, so I teach anatomy, both lecture and lab. We coordinate lab because we have quite a few students.
What are you doing in the lab these days?
What was that?
What are you doing in the lab these days?
Oh, we're doing the brain. Actually,
Yeah.
this unit we're looking at the brain, which is very exciting for me. It's one of my, obviously, not surprisingly, one of my favorite things to teach about. So, so we're looking at the brain and head and neck in general, but it's
The
a lot
cranial
of
nerves
fun.
and all that stuff.
Yeah. Yep. Cranial nerves, all of it. Yeah. We look at cross sections, radiology, so that they can see the anatomy like they will in the clinic too. So it's great.
I'm tomorrow. This is totally a side here, but tomorrow I'm doing I'm a standardized patient at the med school here, and
Okay.
so I'll be in Toronto. It's about neurology because my brain injuries, obviously what they'll ask you about and stuff. So and they'll do the whole cranial nerves like glass, looking at vision, say which nerves, why is this? When he looks up here or looks down here or looks sideways, what does he? Why is he looking at this weird? And what nerve muscle are you looking at? So it's all
That's really interesting. That's very cool. It's awesome that you do that.
No, thank you. It's really great. It's a good program. It's a great program. It's fun to learn about stuff. I've learned it in university a bit, but also now I'm doing this for years now, so I learn again, and I learn all about the cranial nerves and stuff, and not all about them, but just brief 2 hours I'm with the students and the tutor, teacher, prof, whatever, doctor. So So anyway, but so where can people find? So that go way back now. I'm jumping around there too much. But the brain and youth sports. If you want to say the youth brain and sports, but the brain and youth sports by Dr. Julie Stamm. And where can they find that?
You can find that on Amazon or other online retailers, Barnes and Noble too. And if you go to my website, juliestamm.com, I have links there where you can purchase. Also, you can follow me on socials and have links there too. It's at Julie Stamm PhD, and that's on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And I already follow you, so I don't need to listen to that part. But yes, so but I recommend everyone to go buy the book and learn about this very interesting topic and important topic. So thank you so much, Dr. Stamm.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thanks. Music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound, www.bensound.com.